It began without warning, without reason, without mercy. One evening, a man would sit among his family, sharing bread, speaking of ordinary things, unaware that something invisible had already taken hold within him. By morning, his body would burn with fever. His head would throb. His strength would vanish as if drained by an unseen force. And before the next sunrise, he would be dead. No battle had been fought. No enemy had been seen. Yet death had arrived, swift and absolute. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A sickness in one household, then another. Illness was not unfamiliar to the medieval world. Fevers came and went. People died. Life continued. But this was different. This sickness did not linger. It did not give time for prayer or recovery. It struck like lightning fast, violent, and final. Entire families began to fall within days. Neighbors who had spoken to each other in the morning were gone by nightfall. Something had changed, and no one understood what. The symptoms were as terrifying as the speed. High fevers consumed the body, leaving victims delirious and weak. Pain spread through the limbs, sharp and relentless. Then came the swellings, dark, unnatural lumps forming beneath the skin, often along the neck, under the arms, or in the groin. They grew rapidly, turning black and purple, as if the body itself was rotting from within. People whispered about them in fear, avoiding even the mention, as though words alone could summon the same fate. Panic began quietly. A mother noticing her child's sudden fever. A merchant refusing to enter a house where someone had died. A priest called too often to deliver last rites. The rhythm of daily life started to falter. Markets grew quieter. Conversations became shorter, more cautious. Eyes lingered longer on signs of sickness, on a cough, a stumble, a pale face. Every human interaction carried a new, unspoken question. Is this how it begins? Then the pattern became undeniable. Streets that once echoed with movement and trade grew still. Doors remained shut. Windows were barred. People began to withdraw from one another, not out of anger, but out of fear. Trust, once the foundation of community, began to erode. Friends stopped visiting. Families kept their distance. Even acts of kindness became dangerous. To care for the sick was to risk joining them. The speed of the spread defied logic. Villages miles apart began to report the same horrors. Towns that had no contact with each other seemed to fall at the same time. It felt as though the illness moved with intention, choosing its victims without pattern or mercy. Rumors traveled faster than understanding. Some spoke of poisoned air. Others whispered of divine punishment. A few claimed it was carried by strangers, by traitors, by anyone from beyond their walls. Fear fed on uncertainty, and uncertainty was everywhere. As the days passed, the scale of the outbreak grew impossible to ignore. Graves were dug faster, yet still not fast enough. Church bells rang constantly, marking death after death until the sound itself became unbearable. In some places, the bells fell silent, not because death had stopped, but because there was no one left to ring them. The rituals that once gave meaning to death began to collapse under the weight of sheer numbers. Inside homes, the situation was even more desperate. The sick lay in their beds, often alone, abandoned not from cruelty, but from survival. Those who remained healthy faced an impossible choice: stay and risk infection, or leave and abandon those they loved. Many chose to flee, believing distance might offer protection. But wherever they went, the sickness seemed to follow. Escape became an illusion. Communities that had once been tightly bound began to fracture. Laws lost their meaning when those who enforced them were gone. Order gave way to instinct. Some hoarded food and supplies, locking themselves away from the world. Others turned to desperation, looting abandoned homes or fleeing into the countryside. The social fabric, carefully built over generations, began to unravel in a matter of weeks. Amid the chaos, explanations were sought with urgency. People needed to understand what they were facing, to give it a name, a cause, something that could be fought or avoided. But there were no answers. The illness did not behave like anything they had seen before. It did not respect wealth or status. The rich died as quickly as the poor. The strong fell alongside the weak. No pattern could be trusted, no protection relied upon. The fear became all-consuming. It was not just the fear of death, but the fear of the unknown. What was this force that could strike without warning? Why did it spare some and take others? Was it punishment? Chance? Fate? The lack of answers turned fear into something deeper, something heavier. It settled over entire communities like a shadow that could not be lifted. And yet, even in the face of such terror, life struggled to continue. Bread was still baked, though fewer hands remained to make it. Water was still drawn, though fewer dared to gather. People moved through their days with a cautious urgency, aware that every moment might be their last. Conversations became quieter, more deliberate. Every goodbye carried a weight it had never held before. But the illness did not slow. It did not pause. It did not weaken. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger, more relentless with each passing day. What had begun as isolated cases had become a wave unstoppable, overwhelming, consuming everything in its path. Entire neighborhoods were emptied. Entire communities brought to the brink of disappearance. The realization came slowly, then all at once. This was not a passing sickness. This was not something that would fade with time or prayer alone. This was something far greater, something that would reshape the world itself. And as that realization took hold, a deeper fear emerged, not just of dying, but of what would be left behind if the dying never stopped. In that moment, humanity stood at the edge of something it could not yet comprehend. An invisible enemy had arrived, moving silently through every barrier, every boundary, every belief. And once it had begun, there was no turning back. Before the fear, before the silence, there was a world that felt unstoppable. A world alive with motion, ambition, and quiet confidence in its own progress. Across the great cities and distant countrysides, life unfolded with a sense of momentum that had been building for generations. People did not see themselves as fragile. They saw themselves as part of something expanding, something enduring. The idea that it could all vanish so suddenly was beyond imagination. In the early years of the 14th century, Europe stood at a rare moment of balance. The long centuries of instability that had once defined the medieval world had given way to a period of relative order. Kingdoms were more secure, trade routes more reliable, and populations larger than they had been in living memory. Fields stretched across the countryside, carefully cultivated and productive, feeding communities that continued to grow year after year. Villages thrived, towns expanded, and cities began to push beyond the limits of their ancient walls. Within these cities, life was dense, vibrant, and constantly in motion. Narrow streets wound between tall timber buildings, their upper floors leaning inward as if reaching toward each other. Markets overflowed with goods, grain, cloth, spices, tools, each item a sign of connection to a wider world. Merchants called out to passing crowds. Artisans worked tirelessly in small workshops, and the sound of daily life filled every corner. It was chaotic, often crowded, but it was also a sign of prosperity. People gathered because there was opportunity, because there was something to gain. At the heart of these urban centers stood symbols of belief and achievement. Great cathedrals rose above the skyline, their stone towers and intricate designs reflecting both devotion and technical mastery. They were more than places of worship. They were statements of identity, reminders that this society was capable of creating something lasting and magnificent. Construction on these structures could take decades, even centuries. Yet people invested in them with unwavering faith that the future would continue to unfold. Beyond the cities, The countryside played its own essential role in sustaining this growing world. Fields were carefully managed, harvests planned and relied upon. Seasons dictated the rhythm of life, and for many years, those rhythms had been generous. Crops were abundant enough to support rising populations, and while hardship was never absent, there was a sense that the land could provide. This stability allowed communities to expand, families to grow, and economies to strengthen. But perhaps the most remarkable feature of this era was not what existed within individual regions, but how those regions were connected. Trade networks stretched across vast distances, linking places that had once seemed impossibly far apart. Goods moved steadily from one end of the known world to the other, carried by caravans across land and ships across sea. Silk, spices, metals, and ideas traveled together, weaving distant societies into a shared system of exchange. For a merchant standing in a bustling port, the world no longer felt isolated. A shipment arriving from afar was not unusual. It was expected. Routes had been established, partnerships formed, and trust built over time. This flow of goods brought wealth, but it also brought something less tangible, a sense of openness, of possibility. The world was no longer a collection of separate places. It was becoming something interconnected, something dynamic. This interconnectedness extended beyond trade. Knowledge moved alongside goods, carried by scholars, travelers, and storytellers. Techniques improved, technology spread, and ideas took root in places far from where they had originated. There was a quiet confidence that humanity was advancing, that each generation was building upon the last. Even without modern science, there was a belief in progress, in the ability to shape the future. Within this environment, daily life carried a sense of purpose. People worked not just to survive, but to improve their standing, to secure something better for their families. Guilds formed to regulate trades, ensuring quality and stability. Apprentices learned from masters, passing skills from one generation to the next. Systems were in place, roles were defined, and while inequality existed, the structure itself felt dependable. Yet beneath this appearance of strength, certain realities remained unchanged. Cities were crowded beyond their intended capacity. Waste accumulated in streets, and sanitation was minimal by modern understanding. Animals lived close to humans, often within the same spaces. Water sources could be contaminated, and illness, when it appeared, could spread quickly. These conditions were accepted as part of life, rarely questioned, rarely seen as a looming threat. Still, for those living within this world, such concerns did not overshadow the broader sense of stability. Life had risks, as it always had, but it also had continuity. Children were born, trades continued, communities endured. The idea that something could disrupt this entire system on a massive scale felt distant, almost impossible. The structures in place, social, economic, and spiritual, seemed too deeply rooted to be undone. Religion played a central role in reinforcing this sense of order. The belief that life unfolded according to a divine plan provided comfort and explanation. Events, both good and bad, were understood within a framework that gave them meaning. There was trust in this structure, trust that the world operated with a certain logic, even if that logic was not always visible. This faith acted as a foundation, holding communities together through uncertainty. As years passed, the signs of growth became impossible to ignore. Populations continued to rise, placing increasing pressure on resources, but also driving innovation and expansion. New lands were cultivated, new markets established, and new opportunities pursued. It was a world in motion, one that seemed to be moving forward with purpose and direction. And yet, it was precisely this success, this interconnected and densely populated system, that created a hidden vulnerability. The same roads that carried goods could carry unseen dangers. The same ships that brought wealth could bring something far less welcome. The closeness that allowed communities to thrive could also allow something destructive to spread without resistance. But in this moment, none of that was visible. The world appeared strong, resilient, and full of promise. People lived their lives with an expectation of continuity, planning for seasons ahead, investing in futures they believed would come. The structures around them, cities, trade networks, institutions, reinforced that belief at every turn that it was a world at its peak. Not because it was perfect, but because it was functioning, growing, and deeply interconnected. A world that had found a rhythm and settled into it. And within that rhythm, there was a quiet assumption that tomorrow would resemble today, that the systems in place would endure, that life would continue as it always had. That assumption would not last. It did not arrive with an army, nor with banners or warning. It moved quietly, carried in the shadows of ordinary life, hidden within the very systems people trusted most. Long before anyone understood what was happening, it was already in motion, crossing distances that seemed impossible, slipping through borders that had never been meant to stop something unseen. The roads that connected the world, the ships that sustained it, had become something else entirely. At the edges of distant landscapes, far from the crowded cities of Europe, the first movements began. Caravans continued their journeys as they always had, winding across vast stretches of land, linking one region to another in an unbroken chain of exchange. Traders loaded their goods, secured their routes, and traveled with confidence, unaware that among their cargo was something far more dangerous than anything they intended to carry. There were no signs, no signals that could be read. The threat did not announce itself. It simply traveled. Each stop along these routes brought new interactions, new hands touching the same goods, new faces gathering in shared spaces, new exchanges that seemed routine. Markets bustled as they always had, with buyers and sellers negotiating, moving, living within the rhythm of trade. But within that rhythm, something invisible passed from one place to the next. It did not need permission. It did not need recognition. It only needed movement. As caravans reached trading outposts, the process repeated itself. Goods were unloaded, sorted, and redistributed. People gathered closely, often in confined spaces, sharing time, air, and proximity. In these moments, the unseen continued its journey. A single contact became several. Several became many. And with each passing day, the distance it covered expanded beyond comprehension. From land it moved to sea. Ports stood as gateways between worlds, where ships arrived heavy with cargo and departed just as full. Sailors, merchants, dockworkers all played their part in maintaining this flow. Ropes were tied, goods transferred, contracts negotiated. Life continued with purpose and urgency. But beneath the surface of this activity, something had already taken hold. The ships themselves became vessels not just of trade, but of transmission. A single journey could carry the unseen across vast waters in a matter of weeks. What began in one region could appear in another without warning, as though it had materialized out of nothing. Ports that had never shared direct contact found themselves linked by a common fate. The same patterns began to emerge: sudden illness, rapid decline, unexplained deaths. Yet at this stage, the connection remained invisible to those experiencing it. The nature of this movement made it impossible to contain. There was no single point of origin that could be isolated, no clear path that could be blocked. Every route was a potential pathway. Every interaction, no matter how small, carried risk. The very systems that had brought prosperity, trade networks, travel routes, shared spaces, had become the mechanisms of spread. As reports began to circulate, they were fragmented and inconsistent. One region spoke of a strange sickness. Another described sudden deaths. Some accounts were dismissed as exaggeration, others as distant problems that would remain contained. The idea that these events were connected did not take hold immediately. It was easier to believe in isolated incidents than to accept the possibility of something far larger. Meanwhile, the movement continued. Ships docked, unloaded, and departed again. Caravans crossed borders, entered cities, and moved on. The cycle did not pause. Even as suspicion began to grow in certain places, the need for trade outweighed the fear of the unknown. Goods had to move. Markets had to function. The system could not simply stop, not without consequences that seemed just as dangerous in a different way. In some regions, attempts were made to impose caution. Ships were inspected, travelers questioned, rumors considered more seriously. But these efforts came too late, and they were too limited. The unseen had already passed through. By the time fear reached a place, the cause of that fear was often already present, quietly spreading beneath the surface. The progression was relentless. Coastal regions became the first points of impact, their constant contact with distant lands making them especially vulnerable. From there, the movement turned inward, following rivers, roads, and human paths deeper into the heart of each region. What had once been lines of connection became channels of devastation, guiding the spread with efficiency that no one had intended. Inland cities, connected by well-established routes, began to experience the same patterns that had appeared elsewhere. Travelers carried stories of illness, but they also carried the illness itself. Inns, markets, and gathering places became points of convergence, where the unseen could pass from one person to another without resistance. Each new location added to the growing web of transmission. The speed of it all defied expectation. What should have taken months seemed to unfold in weeks. What should have been contained within regions spread across entire continents. Distance, once a barrier, had become irrelevant. The interconnected world that had taken generations to build was now acting as a single, unified pathway for something no one could stop. As the scale of the spread became clearer, a deeper realization began to form. This was not a series of isolated outbreaks. This was something coordinated by circumstance, driven by movement itself. The very act of living, of trading, traveling, interacting, had become the means by which it advanced. To continue as before was to allow it to spread. To stop was to disrupt everything that society depended on. Faced with this paradox, communities struggled to respond. Some attempted to isolate themselves, cutting off contact, closing gates, refusing entry. Others continued as they had, either out of necessity or disbelief. But neither approach offered certainty. The unseen had already demonstrated its ability to move without detection, to arrive before it was recognized. The networks that once symbolized strength now revealed their hidden cost. Connection had brought growth, wealth, and opportunity, but it had also created a level of exposure that no one had anticipated. Every link in the chain, every point of contact had become a vulnerability. And as long as those connections remained active, the movement would continue. There was no single moment when the spread could be said to have reached its peak. It did not crest like a wave. It expanded, layer by layer, region by region, until it seemed to exist everywhere at once. The silence of one place was echoed in another. The fear of one community mirrored in the next. What had begun quietly had become something vast, something that moved with a force far greater than any individual or city. And yet, even as this realization took hold, the movement did not slow. It could not be negotiated with, could not be reasoned against. It followed the paths that had been laid out long before it existed, using them with a precision that felt almost deliberate. Trade and travel had built a connected world. Now that same world was carrying something through its every vein, something that would not stop until there was nothing left to carry it forward. The collapse did not happen all at once. It began in fragments, small failures that, at first, seemed temporary. A marketplace that opened later than usual. A street left uncleaned. A workshop shuttered for a day, then another. But as the deaths increased, these disruptions began to overlap, to compound. until the systems that once held everything together started to give way under a pressure they were never designed to endure. In the crowded cities, where life had always depended on constant movement and cooperation, the impact was immediate and devastating. People lived close together, worked side by side, shared spaces without thought. Now that closeness became a liability. As the sickness spread through neighborhoods, entire buildings fell silent. Families disappeared behind closed doors, their absence noticed only when no one emerged for days. The familiar rhythm of the city voices' footsteps, trade, began to fade, replaced by an unnatural stillness. Fear spread faster than understanding. No one could explain why the illness struck as it did, or how it chose its victims. Theories emerged, each attempting to impose order on chaos. Some believed the air itself had been corrupted, carrying death with every breath. Others looked to the heavens, convinced that unseen forces had aligned against humanity. There were those who blamed outsiders, strangers, or hidden enemies within their own communities. In the absence of knowledge, belief filled the void, but belief offered no protection. Authorities, once symbols of stability and control, found themselves powerless. Officials attempted to enforce order, but as the sickness reached deeper into the population, their numbers dwindled. Courts closed because there were no judges left to preside. Laws became irrelevant when there was no one to enforce them. The structure of governance, built over years, unraveled in a matter of weeks. Decisions that once required careful deliberation were replaced by desperate, often ineffective measures. Medical understanding proved equally inadequate. Those tasked with healing the sick relied on knowledge that could not account for what they were facing. Treatments were applied with confidence at first, then with growing uncertainty. Remedies that had once been trusted now seemed to fail without exception. Patients continued to die, regardless of intervention. Each failed attempt eroded confidence further, not only in the healers, but in the very idea that the crisis could be controlled. As deaths mounted, the practical challenges became overwhelming. The dead had to be buried, but there were fewer and fewer people willing or able to perform the task. Traditional rituals, once carried out with care and reverence, were abandoned in the face of necessity. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be removed. In some places, they were left where they lay, a stark and unavoidable presence in the lives of the living. The boundary between life and death, once clearly defined, began to blur. Within homes, the situation was even more intimate and more tragic. Families faced impossible choices as the illness moved from one member to another. To stay close was to risk infection. To withdraw was to abandon those in need. Many chose survival, isolating themselves from loved ones in an attempt to avoid the same fate. Others remained, caring for the sick despite the risk, often falling ill themselves soon after. In either case, the outcome was frequently the same. The psychological toll deepened with each passing day. The constant presence of death reshaped how people saw the world around them. What had once been familiar became threatening. A simple cough could trigger panic. A passing stranger could be viewed with suspicion. Trust, once essential to community life, was replaced by caution and distance. Social bonds weakened, not because people no longer valued them, but because maintaining them had become dangerous. Public spaces, once centers of activity, became reminders of loss. Markets stood half empty, their stalls unattended. Streets that had once been crowded now echoed with absence. Even places of worship, traditionally seen as sources of comfort, became sites of fear. Gatherings meant to offer solace often resulted in further spread, turning refuge into risk. The institutions that had once unified people now struggled to function under the weight of the crisis. In the face of such uncertainty, some sought meaning in extreme ways. Acts of public devotion intensified, driven by the belief that the crisis was a form of punishment or trial. Others turned to blame, searching for someone or something to hold responsible. These reactions, though different in form, shared a common origin: the need to make sense of what could not be understood. But instead of providing clarity, they often deepened division and fear. As the situation worsened, the breakdown of normal life became complete. Essential services ceased to operate. Food distribution faltered as those responsible for it fell ill or fled. Supply chains, already strained, collapsed entirely in some areas. Hunger began to accompany disease, adding another layer of suffering to an already overwhelming situation. Survival became the only priority, overshadowing all other concerns. The speed of the collapse left little time for adaptation. There was no gradual adjustment, no opportunity to develop effective responses. Each day brought new losses, new challenges, and fewer resources to address them. The systems that had once supported life, economic, social, and institutional, were dismantled not by a single event, but by the cumulative impact of countless individual failures. At the height of the crisis, entire sections of cities were effectively abandoned. Those who could leave did so, seeking safety and distance. Those who remained often did so because they had no choice. The sense of isolation grew, even within densely populated areas. People lived surrounded by others, yet felt entirely alone, cut off not just physically, but emotionally. The inability to understand the cause of the crisis amplified its impact. Without a clear explanation, every attempt to respond was uncertain. Measures were taken based on belief rather than evidence, and when those measures failed, confidence eroded further. The idea that the situation could be controlled, or even influenced, began to fade. In its place came a sense of inevitability, a belief that the course of events could not be altered. And so the collapse continued, not as a single moment of destruction, but as an ongoing process of erosion. Each loss weakened the structure further, making the next loss more damaging. Each failure reduced the capacity to respond, accelerating the decline. What had once been a functioning society became something fragmented, unstable, and deeply uncertain. In the end, it was not just the number of deaths that defined this moment, but the way those deaths reshaped everything around them. The systems that had supported life were stripped away, revealing how dependent they had been on continuity and cooperation. Without those elements, even the strongest structures proved fragile. The cities still stood. The buildings remained. But the life within them had changed in ways that could not be easily reversed. What had been lost was not just population, but the sense of order, trust, and understanding that had once held everything together. And in that loss, the true depth of the collapse became clear. When the dying finally slowed, it did not feel like victory. It felt like absence. The same streets remained, the same buildings stood, but something essential had been stripped away. Doors hung open where entire families had once lived. Workshops sat untouched, their tools abandoned mid-task. Fields lay unharvested, their crops left to decay where they grew. It was not destruction in the way people understood it. It was something quieter, more unsettling, a world that looked familiar, but no longer functioned as it once had. Those who survived emerged into this altered landscape with uncertainty. The immediate fear of illness began to fade, but it was replaced by a different kind of unease. The systems that had once provided structure, labor, trade, governance had been disrupted so completely that returning to the old ways was no longer possible. There were simply not enough people to fill the roles that had once been taken for granted. Every absence created a gap, and those gaps began to reshape the entire fabric of society. In the countryside, the effects were especially visible. Land that had been carefully cultivated for generations now lay idle. Entire villages had disappeared, leaving behind only empty homes and overgrown paths. Those who remained found themselves surrounded by opportunity, but also by uncertainty. With fewer hands to work the land, the balance of power began to shift. Labor, once abundant and easily replaced, had become scarce. For the first time in living memory, those who worked the land could demand better conditions, greater freedom, a voice in decisions that had previously been imposed upon them. This shift did not happen without resistance. Those who had once held authority attempted to restore the old order, to reassert control over a system that had defined their power. Laws were introduced to fix wages, to limit movement, to bind people to roles that no longer fit the reality of the world around them. But enforcement proved difficult. With populations reduced and communities fragmented, authority was no longer absolute. The balance had changed, and it could not easily be reversed. In the cities, a similar transformation unfolded. Trade began to recover, but it did so in a different form. With fewer people, competition lessened, and opportunities emerged for those who remained. Positions that had once been difficult to attain became accessible. Wealth, though unevenly distributed, began to concentrate in new ways. Some individuals rose rapidly, filling the spaces left behind, while others struggled to adapt to a world that no longer followed familiar patterns. At the same time, the psychological impact of what had occurred lingered beneath the surface. The memory of sudden loss, of entire communities disappearing, could not be easily forgotten. It shaped how people saw the world, how they understood their place within it. There was a growing awareness of fragility, a recognition that stability was not guaranteed. This awareness influenced decisions, behaviors, and expectations in ways that extended far beyond the immediate aftermath. Belief systems, once steady and unquestioned, began to shift as well. The crisis had challenged long-held assumptions about order and meaning. Institutions that had been relied upon for guidance had been unable to provide clear answers or effective solutions. For some, this led to deeper devotion, a renewed commitment to faith as a source of stability. For others, it raised questions that had not been asked before, introducing a sense of doubt that would continue to develop over time. Art and expression began to reflect these changes. Themes of mortality, transience, and uncertainty became more prominent. The idea that life could end without warning, that status and wealth offered no protection, found its way into how people represented the world around them. These expressions were not merely reflections of fear, but attempts to process and understand an experience that had defied explanation. Economically, the reduction in population created conditions that would influence development for generations. With fewer people to share resources, standards of living began to shift in certain areas. Access to land, goods, and opportunities increased for some, altering the distribution of wealth and power. This did not create equality, but it did disrupt long-standing hierarchies, opening the possibility for change where previously there had been little. The interconnected nature of the world, once seen primarily as a strength, was now understood with greater caution. Movement and trade continued, but there was a heightened awareness of the risks they carried. Measures were gradually introduced to monitor and control interaction. Early attempts to manage the kind of spread that had proven so devastating. These efforts were imperfect, but they marked a shift in how societies approached collective risk. Over time, the immediate signs of devastation began to fade. Buildings were repaired or repurposed. Fields were brought back into use. New families moved into spaces left vacant. Life, in its persistent way, continued. But the changes that had taken place beneath the surface remained. The world that was being rebuilt was not the same as the one that had been lost. It carried with it the imprint of what had occurred, shaping its development in subtle but lasting ways. The experience had revealed both the strength and the vulnerability of human systems. It had shown how quickly order could give way to chaos, how deeply interconnected structures could amplify both growth and collapse. These lessons, though not always consciously understood, influenced decisions and behaviors moving forward. They became part of the collective memory, informing how societies adapted to future challenges. For the individuals who lived through it, the transformation was personal as much as it was societal. Relationships had been broken, communities altered, expectations changed. The future no longer felt as predictable as it once had. There was a greater emphasis on the present, on what could be controlled in the moment, rather than on distant plans that might never come to pass. As years passed, new generations grew up in a world shaped by these changes, often without fully understanding their origin. To them, the structures and conditions they inherited seemed normal, even though they were the result of a profound disruption. The memory of the crisis persisted in stories, in traditions, in subtle shifts of behavior, but it gradually moved from lived experience to historical understanding. Yet its influence did not diminish. The transformation it set in motion continued to unfold, affecting economic systems, social structures, and cultural perspectives. It altered the trajectory of development in ways that could not have been predicted at the time. What had begun as a moment of overwhelming loss became a turning point, redirecting the course of history. In the end, the aftermath was not defined solely by what had been destroyed, but by what emerged in its place. A world changed not just in population, but in perception. A society forced to adapt, to rebuild, and to reconsider its assumptions. The scars remained, visible in some places, hidden in others, but always present as a reminder of how quickly everything could change, and how deeply those changes could shape what came next.